In 1868, a French geologist named Louis Lartet was clearing dirt out of a limestone rock shelter near the village of Les Azes when he uncovered a human skull with the face pitted through with dozens of small round holes. The man had died close to 28,000 years earlier. He was somewhere under 50 when it happened, which in his world counted as old. For years before his death, a bacterial infection had been eating slowly through the bone of his face, the kind of infection that today gets treated with antibiotics in a single course. Nobody in his group had antibiotics. What they had instead was each other, because the wound pattern on his skull shows a chronic condition that a dying man could not have survived alone for as long as he did. That skeleton, now known simply as the Old Man of Cro-Magnon, is where the real story of ancient aging begins. And it does not begin with wisdom, respect, or comfortable decline. It begins with rot, visible on bone that still shows it, thousands of years after the man himself stopped feeling anything at all. It begins with a body visibly failing in front of a small group of people who had nowhere to look away to and no way to fix what they were looking at. Growing old in the ancient world meant living inside a body that was breaking down in ways everyone around you could see, hear, and smell, with no privacy for the process and no guarantee that decline would be met with patience instead of dread. The evidence suggests the fear was not irrational, it was earned. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The easy assumption is that ancient people did not have to fear growing old because almost nobody actually got there. Life in the Paleolithic gets described so often as short and brutal that it becomes tempting to picture entire populations dying in their 20s and 30s. Old age itself, a rare accident, rather than a stage of life anyone had to plan for or dread. That assumption holds a grain of truth and misses the larger picture completely. The confusion comes from how life expectancy gets calculated. Average life expectancy at birth in a small-scale foraging population looks brutally low, often somewhere in the 20s or 30s, but that average is dragged down almost entirely by infant and childhood mortality, not by adults dropping dead the moment they hit 30. Michael Gervin of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Hillard Kaplan of the University of New Mexico published a study in 2007 in the journal Population and Development Review that compiled mortality data across dozens of hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist populations worldwide. Once someone survived childhood, the risk of death dropped sharply and stayed low for decades. Gervin and Kaplan found that mortality hazards stayed roughly flat through much of adulthood, only beginning to climb around age 40, then doubling again roughly every 7 to 10 years after that. The modal age at adult death, meaning the single most common age at which an adult who had survived childhood actually died, landed somewhere between 68 and 78 years old. That is not a world without old people. That is a world where old age was an ordinary, expected outcome for a large share of the adults who made it past the dangerous years of early childhood, and the fossil record backs this up directly. Rachel Kaspari, then at the University of Michigan, and Sang-Hee Lee at the University of California, Riverside, published a 2004 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences comparing the ratio of older to younger adults across 4 successive periods of hominid evolution, using the wear patterns on molar teeth to sort individuals by age. The trend toward more people surviving into older adulthood ran through the entire 3 million years of the sample, but it accelerated sharply, and suddenly starting around 30,000 years ago, in the early Upper Paleolithic, when the number of adults old enough to have been grandparents jumped roughly 4-fold compared to earlier periods. Growing old was not the exception. It was becoming, for the first time in the archaeological record, something close to normal, which raises a harder question than whether people got old. It raises the question of what happened to them once they did, and what it did to a body never designed to keep running this long. There is a specific biological reason old age in any species, including this one, involves the body turning against itself, and it has nothing to do with wearing out the way a tool wears out from use. In 1952, the British biologist Peter Medawar published a short book called An Unsolved Problem in Biology, laying out an argument that reshaped how evolutionary science understands aging. Medawar pointed out that natural selection is powerful only in proportion to how many individuals are alive to be selected on at a given age. In the wild, across almost every species, far more individuals die young from predation, accident, disease, and starvation than from anything resembling old age, which means that by the time an individual reaches an advanced age, natural selection has already lost most of its grip on that individual's genes. Medawar called this the selection shadow. Any harmful mutation whose effects only appear late in life, after most of an individual's reproduction is already finished, faces almost no evolutionary pressure to be weeded out, because by the time it does damage, its carrier has usually already passed on their genes. Those mutations simply accumulate across generations, undisturbed, because natural selection was never watching that part of the timeline closely. 5 years later, George Williams, then at Michigan State University, pushed the idea further in a 1957 paper in the journal Evolution. Williams argued that natural selection does more than simply overlook some genes in old age. It actively favors them despite the damage they cause later, because the same gene produces a benefit earlier in life, when reproduction is still happening and selection still cares. A hormone that builds strong bones and muscle in youth might, decades later, accelerate the buildup of plaque in blood vessels with no outward sign at all. A gene that sharpens immune response in a young adult fighting off infection might, in old age, tip that same immune system into the kind of chronic inflammation that grinds down joints and organs. Williams called this antagonistic pleiotropy, one gene, two effects, pulling in opposite directions depending on when in life its effects land. Natural selection takes the early benefit and accepts the late cost as the price of doing business, because from evolution's perspective, the business was already finished by the time the cost came due. What this means in practical terms, stripped of the technical language, is that the ancient body was never built with a plan for lasting 60, 70, 80 years. It was built to get an individual through childbearing years and a bit beyond, using genetic strategies that actively trade away long-term durability for short-term strength, fertility, and immune punch. Every ache, every collapsing joint, every organ that slowly loses function past middle age is, at some level, the bill coming due on a trade an individual's genes made decades earlier without ever consulting them. Ancient humans could not have known any of this in the language of genetics and cellular biology, but they did not need to know the mechanism to feel its effects arrive on schedule, joint by joint, organ by organ, in a body they depended on for their own survival, and could feel failing them in real time. Nowhere did that failure show up earlier or more dangerously than in the mouth. In a world without milled grain, boiled porridge, or ground meat, every meal was an act of mechanical labor performed almost entirely by the teeth, and teeth in the Paleolithic wore down at a rate that would alarm a modern dentist. Grit from stone-ground plant food, the sheer physical toughness of raw and lightly cooked meat, and decades of repeated chewing ground molars, down toward the roots, long before an individual reached what would today be considered old age. Once enamel wore through, the exposed dentin underneath decayed faster, abscesses formed, and the pain of eating became part of daily life, rather than an occasional emergency. At the Krapina rock shelter in Croatia, excavated beginning in 1899 by the paleontologist Dragutin Gorjanović Kramberger, researchers eventually recovered more than 275 Neanderthal teeth dated to roughly 130,000 years ago. In 1987, the anthropologists David Freyer and Milford Russell published a study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology documenting fine artificial grooves cut into the sides of several Krapina molars and premolars, the kind of wear pattern produced by repeatedly working something thin and abrasive, likely a grass stem or a sliver of bone, between the teeth. The most convincing explanation is not idle habit. It is pain management. A very similar pattern turned up decades later and thousands of kilometers away, in a Neanderthal specimen from the Cova Forada site in Valencia, Spain, examined by the researcher Marina Lozano and colleagues, whose molars showed heavy wear, active periodontal disease, and the same telltale grooves from what the researchers describe as habitual use of a dental probe to relieve the pain of inflamed, receding gums. None of this required modern dentistry to notice, and it did not require a written record either, since the wear patterns themselves are the record, preserved in enamel long after everything soft enough to rot has disappeared. It required only living long enough for the mechanical damage to accumulate, and it happened to individuals across tens of thousands of years, and multiple hominin populations, which tells you the problem was not a fluke of one unlucky group. It was the default outcome of aging on a Paleolithic diet. Losing molars did not simply mean discomfort. It meant losing access to the tougher, more calorie-dense parts of the diet: tendon, cartilage, dried meat, hard roots, and being pushed toward whatever soft food the rest of the group happened to be processing that day, if anyone was processing food for you at all. In a world with no purees, no soup kitchens, and no guaranteed sharing, a mouth that could no longer chew was a body one bad season away from starving in the middle of a group that still had plenty to eat. The fear here was not abstract. It sat behind every worn, aching tooth, a countdown that a person could feel tightening with every hard bite that hurt a little more than the last one. Tooth pain, at least, could sometimes be managed. Disease and visible physical breakdown were harder to hide and harder to survive, and the Old Man of Cro-Magnon shows exactly how far that breakdown could go before it became fatal. Analysis of his skull identified the cause of the extensive pitting across his face as a chronic bacterial infection, most likely a form of actinomycosis, a slow, disfiguring bone infection that in the modern world responds to antibiotics, but in the Upper Paleolithic simply ran its course over months or years, eating through bone in a process that would have been visible and likely foul-smelling to everyone around him. He was buried alongside pierced shell ornaments, in the same group grave as several other adults and a child, radiocarbon dated to roughly 28,000 years old. The significance of that burial is not that it proves people cared for the sick and disfigured out of pure warmth. Caution matters here. The bioarchaeologists James Wood, George Milner, Henry Harpending, and Kenneth Weiss published an influential 1992 paper in Current Anthropology known as the osteological paradox, warning against the easy assumption that visible skeletal damage always tells a simple story. An individual with extensive healed pathology, they argued, might represent either a fragile person who barely survived or, just as plausibly, a resilient one whose body was strong enough to fight off infections and injuries that would have killed a weaker person outright before any trace could form on the bone. Skeletal evidence of long-term illness proves survival, not comfort, and it says nothing on its own about how that survival felt or how it was received by the people around it. What the old man's skeleton does show, without ambiguity, is duration. A disfiguring, likely foul-smelling infection that progressed slowly enough to leave this much bone damage means he lived with active, visible disease for a long stretch of time, in full view of a small, close-quartered group with nowhere to retreat to and no way to disguise what was happening to his face. Whatever mixture of tolerance, disgust, obligation, and care kept him alive that long, it happened under conditions of total visibility that modern people rarely experience even once. There was no private hospital room, no closed door, no version of illness that stayed hidden from the people whose help you needed to keep eating. Aging into disease in that world meant becoming, quite literally, a spectacle of decline that the entire group had to witness and decide how to respond to, day after day, for as long as the body held out. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That visibility cut in more than one direction, and the clearest evidence comes not from a man disfigured by disease, but from a woman marked by an old injury, buried with more ceremony than almost anyone else recovered from her era. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, a Gravettian site radiocarbon dated to roughly 26,000 years ago, archaeologists in 1949 uncovered the remains of a woman between 36 and 45 years old, an age that, by the standard established in the Kasperi and Lee study, placed her solidly among the oldest members of her community. Paleopathological analysis, refined decades later using CT scanning and three-dimensional reconstruction, confirmed that she carried pronounced facial asymmetry from a traumatic injury sustained in childhood, a mark she would have carried, visibly, for the rest of her long life. Her burial was anything but ordinary. Her remains were covered in red ochre, a pigment repeatedly associated with ritual significance across Upper Paleolithic Europe, and two mammoth scapulae, the large flat shoulder bones of an animal whose hunting represented enormous communal effort, were placed directly over her body. Researchers studying the site, including work synthesized by Eric Trinkhaus and colleagues, have offered competing interpretations of what this treatment meant, ranging from high status tied to a specialized ritual role to a burial pattern reflecting anxiety about a body that looked visibly different from the rest of the group. Both readings can be true at once, and that is precisely the point. A body marked by decades of visible physical difference, whether from an old injury or from the ordinary wear of advanced age, did not end up in an unremarkable grave. It received an unusually elaborate, deliberate response, the kind of response people reserve for things that unsettle them as much as they command respect. This is where the story of ancient aging resists a tidy answer. The evidence does not show a single, consistent emotional reaction to growing old and visibly different. It shows a pattern of intensified attention, sometimes swinging toward reverence, sometimes toward apparent unease, but rarely toward indifference. A body that had survived long enough to look unlike the younger bodies around it became, in some sense, a marked body, one whose meaning the rest of the group had to actively negotiate rather than simply ignore. That negotiation, played out in ochre, in careful burial, in whatever conversations left no trace at all, is the closest thing the archaeological record offers to direct evidence of how strongly the visible signs of aging registered on the people who had to look at them every day. There is a reason that intensity of reaction should not come as a surprise, and it has less to do with prehistory specifically than with how humans, across cultures and centuries, respond to bodies that no longer fit clean categories. In 1909, the French anthropologist Arnold van Gennep published a study called Les Rites de Passage, arguing that human societies mark major life transitions, birth, adolescence, marriage, death, with ritual precisely because the person mid-transition occupies a dangerous, ambiguous status. Van Gennep called this the liminal phase, a state of being neither fully one thing nor fully another, and he observed that liminal individuals across an enormous range of documented cultures are treated with a mixture of heightened ritual attention and social unease, sometimes even isolation, until their new status is confirmed and settled. Old age fits this pattern more precisely than it first appears to. An aging body is not simply an older version of a young one. It is a body visibly departing from the fertile, physically capable category that defines full adult membership in a small foraging group, without yet having crossed into the fixed, settled category of the dead. It is a body caught between statuses, still present, still needing food and shelter and inclusion, but no longer able to contribute in all the ways that once secured that inclusion automatically. Van Gennep's model helps explain why the archaeological evidence keeps producing exactly this kind of ambivalence, not simple reverence and not simple abandonment, but a persistent, unresolved tension between the two, showing up again and again in burials, in dental interventions, in whatever fragments of behavior around the aged managed to survive tens of thousands of years. That tension would have been felt from both directions at once. The aging individual watched their own status shift in real time, their opinions still respected in some settings, their physical contribution to hunting or heavy labor gradually no longer counted on in others. The people around them had to continuously renegotiate what an aging member of the group was owed, and what that member could still be expected to give back. Neither side had a fixed script to follow, because no one in a small, mobile band of 20 to 50 people could simply defer the question to an institution, a pension system, a retirement age, or a professional class of caregivers. Every accommodation for an aging body had to be worked out directly, person to person, inside a group, with limited food and no margin for permanent, uncompensated dependency. The fear of growing old, seen this way, was not primarily a fear of death. It was a fear of becoming permanently, visibly unclassifiable, a status the people around you had not yet decided how to hold. The clearest, most systematic evidence for how that unresolved tension could tip toward its harshest resolution comes not from a single site, but from a large body of ethnographic data compiled well outside the fossil record. In 1945, the Yale University sociologist Leo Simmons published a book called The Role of the Aged in Primitive Society, built on a systematic cross-cultural survey of 71 traditional societies spanning hunting, herding, fishing, and small-scale farming economies across every inhabited continent. Simmons was not interested in a single dramatic case. He wanted a pattern, and he found one. Across his sample, the treatment of elderly members correlated closely with two factors above all others: the severity of the physical environment a group had to survive in, and the degree of control an aging individual retained over food, property, or specialized knowledge that the rest of the group still needed. Where the environment was forgiving and food supplies were reasonably stable, elderly individuals, particularly those who held on to valued knowledge, tools, or social authority, tended to retain real status and material support well into physical decline, sometimes gaining influence precisely because their long memory of past droughts, migrations, and hard winters made them more valuable, not less, as conditions changed. Where the environment turned harsh, where resources were seasonal, unpredictable, or thin enough that feeding one more mouth genuinely threatened the survival of the group, Simmons documented practices ranging from quiet neglect and reduced food allocation, through deliberate abandonment during migration, to active killing of the aged in the most extreme cases, most heavily concentrated among societies operating at the edge of survivable subsistence, in Arctic, subarctic, and other resource-scarce environments. These were not universal practices carried out casually or without conflict. Simmons's own data show they were often surrounded by ritual, reluctance, and, in numerous documented accounts, initiated or requested by the elderly individual themselves, rather than imposed entirely from outside, a detail that complicates any simple story of younger generations discarding their elders without a second thought. Simmons's data placed Arctic and subarctic groups such as the Chukchi toward the harsh end of that spectrum, in environments where a failed hunt could threaten the whole group within weeks, while societies with stable agriculture and clearly defined ceremonial roles for elders, such as the Hopi of the American Southwest, clustered much closer to the opposite end, where age brought accumulating authority rather than accumulating risk. The same species produced both patterns, depending entirely on how much margin the local environment allowed. What Simmons's cross-cultural pattern demonstrates, stripped of its emotional weight, is that the fear of growing old in a resource-constrained environment was not paranoia. It was an accurate read of real, structural risk. A body that could no longer hunt, forage at full capacity, or travel at the pace a mobile band required was, in the harshest environments documented in his sample, genuinely weighing on a food supply with no slack in it. The correlation Simmons identified between environmental severity and elder abandonment is not evidence that ancient humans were uniquely cruel to their old. It is evidence that the fear embedded in growing old was calibrated with disturbing accuracy to the actual mathematics of survival in a world with no stored surplus, no medicine, and no way to support a member of the group who could no longer contribute without that support coming directly out of everyone else's share. This is also where the archaeological picture and the ethnographic picture converge rather than contradict each other. The same species capable of the elaborate, reverent burial at Dolní Věstonice of feeding a disfigured man through years of visible infection at Cro-Magnon, of carving pain relief grooves into aching teeth at Crepina, was also capable, under different environmental pressure, of the outcomes Simmons documented in the 20th century among societies living at genuine subsistence margins. Both patterns describe the same underlying fact. Old age placed a real, unavoidable demand on a group's limited resources, and how that demand got answered depended less on some fixed trait of human nature and more on how much slack the environment happened to allow in any given place and season. That calculation did not disappear when humans left the Paleolithic behind. It only changed its language. In the 1st century BC, the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero wrote an entire essay, known today as On Old Age, addressing the fear of aging directly, point by point, the loss of active public life, the decline of physical strength, the loss of youthful pleasure, and the nearness of death. Cicero wrote to argue against these fears, which tells you plainly how widespread and how deeply felt they already were among his audience. Nearly 2,000 years after the last Ice Age hunter-gatherers, Caspari and Lee, tracked through the fossil record. A philosopher does not spend an entire essay refuting a fear nobody has. The specific threats have changed. Nobody today loses access to food because their molars wore down to the roots, and modern dentistry, modern medicine, pensions, insurance, and organized elder care have absorbed a great deal of what used to fall entirely and directly on the shoulders of a 20-person foraging band, with no surplus and no institution to spread the cost across. Those systems exist precisely because the underlying problem never went away on its own, but the underlying structure of the fear, the anxiety of becoming visibly, permanently different from the version of yourself that once had a secure, unquestioned place in the group, has not gone anywhere. It shows up in every anti-aging product marketed on the promise of erasing visible signs of decline before anyone notices them. In every workplace where an older employee starts to feel their contribution being reassessed without ever being told so directly. In every culture that still has not fully decided, generation after generation, exactly what an aging body is owed and exactly what it can still be expected to give. The mathematics Simmons documented at the edge of survival has softened considerably. The underlying question it was answering never actually left. The Old Man of Cro-Magnon carried a disfiguring infection on his face for what was likely years, in full view of the small group that fed and sheltered him until the day it finally killed him regardless. That single skeleton, pulled out of a French hillside by a railway crew in 1868, contains the entire argument in miniature. Growing old in the ancient world was not a quiet fade into wisdom and rest. It was a visible, mechanical, often painful unraveling, witnessed daily by people who had to keep deciding, with no institution to decide for them, exactly how much of their limited food, patience, and protection an aging body was still owed. Sometimes that decision produced red ochre and mammoth scapulae laid over a woman's grave with obvious ceremony. Sometimes, at the harsher edges of the world Leo Simmons documented, it produced abandonment instead. Both outcomes came from the same unresolved question, asked again and again across tens of thousands of years, by every group that ever had to look at one of its own members visibly failing and decide what happened next. That question, at its core, never really closed, and it was never going to, not with a body built the way this one was. It changed shape, moved into philosophy, into medicine, into the quiet arithmetic every modern family and every modern workplace still runs when someone they depend on starts, visibly, to slow down. The fear ancient humans carried about growing old was never irrational superstition. It was an early, accurate reading of a problem the species has been negotiating, one aging body at a time, ever since. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.